Okay, I said that I'd do a follow-up on the other videos that I did earlier concerning what Shabir Ally had said a week ago on the 19th of May, a little over a week ago now, and his intent in that video was to say that these variant Qurans, these different readings, kept on referring to these readings, and he referred to the North African reading, and he referred to this one here, the Quran that we have today. This is known as the Hafs text. He never said it by name. He called it the 1924 Egyptian text, or the Cairene text. It's the Hafs text, and you'll see why he didn't want to use the name. And he was saying that if you look at these different Qurans, they don't really change the meaning when it comes to doctrine, when it comes to belief, and when it comes to practice. And so he kept on wanting to refer to that, trying to make sure that we did not did not call these completely different Qurans, that they weren't the same thing. Because as far as he was concerned, they were all saying the same thing as far as doctrine was concerned. Taking from our line concerning our Bible, where we have said very clearly that in the variants that we have, the New Testament, on the Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, the Gospel of John, chapter 7, verse 53 to John 8:11, the woman caught in adultery, and 1 John chapter 5, verse 7 and 8. Those variants that are well known, we've talked about them. They've been around since the 1800s. This is not new material. And our comeback always has been, and rightly so, that when you look at those verses that have been added into Mark and John and in 1 John, there's nothing there that is not found elsewhere. There's no new doctrine. There's no new belief. And so he was trying to take that line and say, when you look at the Warsh, he didn't call it the Warsh, he just called it the North African edition. When you look at the Quran we have today, there's not really any difference. And he was very clear that this did not add anything to the Quran. Now what I want to do now is move on from that and look at what he didn't say, because that was only the first 2 to 3 minutes of a 12-minute video. I want to look at the next 9 minutes, because he made an awful lot of, he exposed himself, and you can see that he was very cautious throughout the video. He wanted to make sure that he could not be pushed into a corner, and that's understandable, because this is something that Shabir has had to work with, my goodness, for quite a few years. I've been engaging with Shabir since 1998, so since the last century, when we had our first debate. We had another one in 1999, another one in 2000. The last one I've had with him, of the 6 debates I've had with him, was in 2014 on this very issue, which is fascinating, because you can see he hasn't moved since 2014. What he is trying to do, and this is something that we need to realize, he's trying to be very careful, because after the 2014 debate, when I really hit him strong with the consonantal variants of these 6 different manuscripts, and I introduced, these are the manuscripts that came from the doctorate put out by Dr. Dan Brubaker, which he got in 2014, and I introduced the Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Maitel manuscript. I introduced the Petropolitanus, the Husseini, and the Sana'a manuscript, those 6 in 2014. At that time, I mentioned that there were substantial differences, about 800, that Dr. Dan Brubaker had found. And he was not prepared for that. He did not know how to answer that. He spent 19 minutes talking about the number 19, as I said earlier. Now we're in 2020. We're 6 years later, and this has come up. It's been a problem. It's been an albatross around his neck. He has to deal with these different Qurans. When Hatun and I, Hatun actually was the one that did all the work. All I did is get up on the ladder with her and help her expose this there at Speaker's Corner back in 2016. And when we held up those Qurans, that's why I put that video up to remind you. We did it actually more than once. I thought we'd only done it once. We'd done it 3 times, it looks like. And that's why I'm wearing different shirts at different times. When we held up those Qurans, and the reaction we got from the Muslims, because it was so devastating for them, because they had never heard that there are different Qurans. You can see then all this is coming back on Shabir Ally, and he's got to answer about this. He's got to come up with some conclusion. And so that's why he put this video out just a week ago, to help people understand what we're talking about. And to be fair, Shabir was trying to be as honest as he could, but he was choosing his words wisely. So that's where I want to go into now. I want to look at the next 9 minutes that he talked about. And I'm not going to play the whole 9 minutes. You can go watch the video yourself. I'm going to quote him, and I'm going to try to give you the minutes where he said it, so you can go look to make sure that I am quoting him correctly, because I don't want to misquote him. And after he talked about these 10 different recitations that they don't refer to beliefs or practice, notice the word he kept on using is recitation, recitation. And that's really where he wanted us to focus on. He really wanted us to focus on recitation. And that's why he spent quite a bit of time from the second minute, about the third minute on, he's talked about these ahruf. He wanted to come back to these ahruf. What he's saying, and this is what Muslims are all saying, and this is one reason why we need to be careful when we listen to Muslims when they try to explain their Quran. They would like us to stick to the ahruf and the qira'at equation. They would like us to stick to the recitations. They would like us to stick to the readings. That's all they really want us to spend our time and energies on, because that is, you can explain, you can pretty much explain away. You can say, listen, there are many different readings. There are many ways to say the same thing in Arabic. There are many different dialects that you can use to say the same thing, but it's always the same thing. It's just the different ways of pronouncing it. We have different ways of pronouncing in English. You can, I mean, the British have told us, we don't even, here in America, that we have yet to learn how to speak English properly. And so there are many derivations on saying the same thing. And that's really what he's trying to get at and trying to keep us focused on. Muslims always want to make sure that this has nothing more to do than the qira'at argument and the ahruf argument, which has been around for almost 1,000 years, when you look and see where the qira'at and the ahruf were delineated. But let's go back and see what he said. He said, these ahruf, now he took it from the word harf. Harf means letter. And notice what he did. He then defined it, and he says this could be letter, this could be limits. However, there are those who consider this to be dialects. So these are dialects, and suddenly that became the definition. These are dialects, he was saying. And he says the way you say it in the different dialects is fine, because remember, it's only those things that are sufficient for salvation, is what he said around the third minute, that we need to be concerned about. So if there's anything that you're saying in a dialectic way differently, or you're citing in a different dialect, if it goes beyond what is sufficient for your salvation. For instance, and notice what the example he gave. For instance, if you have in one case where they're saying there's one God, and then later on, or in another recitation, there are more than one God, and that's a swipe at us. He's confronting Christians because of our view of Jesus as God. Nonetheless, he's saying something that drastic, then we should be concerned. But there's nothing like that in any of these dialectical differences, these recitation, these readings. So you can see he's getting us focused on the readings. He said there were regional dialects during the time of Muhammad, about halfway through the 5th minute. There are regional dialects, and so this makes sense. Now listen what he says there in the 7th minute, and this is what was fascinating.
So the precise words, which are the vehicles through which the important teachings are being disseminated, were not so important. The teachings were important, but the precise words to preserve them were not of paramount importance. They did not trump in importance the need for the message of the Quran to be absorbed, to be practiced, and to be taught by others. And in fact, if the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, had insisted on his followers that they should pay due importance to the wording of the Quran to get every letter and sound correctly, then that may have detracted from the focus on getting the message across and implementing that in the lives of new Muslims.
The precise words were not important, just the teachings. Woo, that's quite an admission. I don't know if any of you picked that up if you watched it. And I'd like to know how Muslims would respond to that. So the precise words were not important, just the teachings. As long as you said the right thing, as long as you got the right belief, as long as you got the right doctrine, as long as you got the right practice, it didn't really matter how you said it, what dialect you said, or even how you pronounced it. If they spent all their time getting every word and every letter correct, that would detract from getting the message across, is what he's saying. So he's already admitted that there could be a possibility that the words were not the same. Well, that shouldn't surprise us too much, because remember, when Muhammad received each one of these revelations between 610 and 632, that 22-year period, he would then recite it every year to his followers, and they would memorize it. Sometimes they'd write it on bones, stones, and pieces of bark. There's no reason why he could have maybe. Did he recite it the same way every year? Was that the same way that was the angel Gabriel had given it to him? He would listen to the other reciters to make sure they heard it right, but who's to say he got it wrong? So you can see these are questions that can come up when you're talking about recitation. Recitation, by definition, is open to corruption. It's open to embellishment. It's open to creating and deleting. That is the nature of the beast of recitation. And he admits that. In the 8th minute and about 8:45 into his talk,
he repeats the saying and the teaching of the Quran without necessarily getting precisely the same words in which they were first delivered by the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace. So there was this period in which Muslims had the opportunity to teach others the Quran without insisting on the precise words. But then it came a phase when, if we allow this to continue ad infinitum, you can imagine that somebody gives it in their own words, and then somebody else gives that new summary in their own words, and then the third person gives it in their own words. Then eventually the whole message can become diluted. The original words will be lost.
Ooh, so he's admitting that you could lose it if you have many people reciting it. And that was the reason, he said, that Uthman in 652 commissioned a committee to make the final text. Now, he jumped to that without even thinking through. And I would have liked him because at that moment, what he was admitting is this is open to a corruption. He's admitting corruption there. There could be corruption in the recited word. He's keeping our focus on the word. I want to get to text because that's going to come up, and that's where where his downfall is. So he's keeping us on this idea of recitation. He's keeping us on this idea of the ahruf in the Qira, these readings, way you say it, these are just dialectical readings. However, he admits, you could get it wrong. There could be many different ways that you recited it. And that's why Uthman was commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit. So who's this Zayd ibn Thabit? Well, see, this is something he didn't talk about. And I would have loved to have talked about this. Who is Zayd ibn Thabit? Well, lo and behold, it turns out that Zayd ibn Thabit is the secretary of Muhammad. Hold on a minute. What do secretaries do? Do they recite what someone has said, or do they write down? Isn't that the job of secretaries, to write down what Muhammad said? So he had 22 years to write this down. Why didn't he write it down? That's a question we need to ask. That's something we could ask later on. Because by the time that Muhammad died, it was not written down. That is very evident when you go back to Sahih Bukhari. And this is why you need to come back to Sahih Bukhari. You need to come back to these two different pages. I'll put them up on the screen so you can see. You need to go back to Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 509 and hadith number 510. Because that is where all Muslims have to go to find out how the Quran was compiled. There is the story. On this page, hadith number 509 is the 632, the recitation of what we know as the Abu Bakr recension, the recension of Abu Bakr. This is 632, between 632 and 634. Read it, and you need to see what it says here. It's very clear that the Quran had not been written down. What we see here, as we read through this, we see, and I'm just going to summarize it because it'll take too long to go through it, and I don't have that much time. It's very clear that when Muhammad died in 632, it had not been written down, and those who had memorized it, these are the companions who had memorized it, were starting to die. In fact, at the Battle of Yamama, 70 of them were killed, according to what the traditions tell us. Now remember, everything I'm going to tell you is on the traditions, but this is what Shabir Ally is dependent on. He's dependent on the same traditions that I'm referring to now, including this one. So here you have in 632 to 634, that 2-year period, sometime there was this Battle of Yamama where 70 of these reciters died. Now, that was so substantial that this caused huge alarm in the ranks, certainly amongst Abu Bakr and Umar, who was going to be the second caliph. They realized that there was a problem here, because if all the reciters died, there would be no Quran. They needed to get this written down, proving to me, and I hope you're picking this up, proving to me that recitation is not good enough. Why didn't Shabir Ally pick this up? Recitation is not good enough. Reading the different ahruf was not good enough, because you have to have it written down at some point so you know what to recite. There has to be something you have to memorize. There has to be something that you read, and that which you read has to be a written text. So you can see Abu Bakr and Umar saw something that Muhammad didn't see, that's something that Zayd ibn Thabit didn't see, because even Zayd ibn Thabit, when he was commissioned and he was given this task to do this, what does he say? How can I do that which the Prophet did not do? He says. In other words, how can I do something that the Prophet didn't even dare to do? He didn't write it down. And who are you asking me now to write what the Prophet didn't do? Nonetheless, he finally relented. And so he wrote it down, just alone. He wrote it down by going to all that had survived. He went to bones, stones, pieces of bark, and he wrote it down. And that was given to Abu Bakr, who then gave it to Umar, who then gave it to his daughter, whose name is Hafsa, or was Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad. Now, here's the big thing that I want to, I would have loved to sat there and talk this over with Shabir Ally. Okay, so you're talking about a written text. So now we're talking about a written text. We're no longer talking about recitation. Let's talk about that written text. Let's talk about that first recitation. Let's talk about that one that happened in 632. That was not copied. It was not sent to any cities. There was no reference of it being a universal copy that was canonized at that time so that everybody then could read it, so they wouldn't have this problem with recitation after that. That was given to a woman named Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad. What did she do with it? Well, we do know, according to the traditions, that she put it under her bed. So she didn't even use it herself. She put it under her bed for safekeeping. Oh dear. 20 years later, then we come to this part of Al-Bukhari. So there's 20 years between these two pages, okay? This is 632, this is 652. 20 years later, we come to this thing. This is where it really gets juicy. And this is where Shabir Ally is having a problem. And this is why he is trying to explain this. So what does he say? Well, here, 20 years later, 652, we're time at Uthman now. Abu Bakr has died. Umar has been killed. Uthman comes to power in 644. We're now about 652. And this guy named Hudayfa, let me just read it to you. Hudayfa, Hudayfa, was afraid. He comes to Uthman. He says he is afraid that the people of Sham and Iraq, Sham would be Syria today in Iraq, so you know where those are on the map, that northern area. The differences, Hudayfa was afraid of that's the people of Sham and Iraq's differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book, as the Jews and the Christians did before them. So this is recitation. And now Shabir Ally's on really strong ground because we're talking about differences in recitation. So he's saying, so this is what they're talking about. These are the different dialects. These are the things that as people start, as he says, as people start doing it, their words, their own words, as they start doing it in their own words, the message could be lost. And this is what Hudayfa is talking about. So he's on strong ground here because he's referring back to Sahih Bukhari. So it could be lost. And that's why, because of the fact the recitations were so different in the northern areas, way up in Syria and Iraq, it's those northern people, they're hopeless when it comes to memorization. It's what I've heard Muslims tell me over and over again. Therefore, that's why Uthman had to then ask it to be written down a second time. Wait a minute. Wasn't it always written down, of course, but second time means there was a first time. Yes, we know there was a first time because that's here in this paper. This is the first time. So it's already written down. You're having people with different recitations. So where's the problem? Just go back to the original. And that's what he does. He goes back and he asks for Hafsa's copy. He gets Zayd ibn Thabit, wakes him up and says, look, you've been not doing anything for 20 years. I want you to now to rewrite it again. Why would you have to rewrite it if it's already written? Why don't they just take Hafsa's copy? Well, it gets even better. Because what it says here is that Uthman has him along with Hisham, Zubair, and Al-As. The four of them. So four of them were to then rewrite it. And if they had any disagreement, I don't know how you can have disagreement. All you're doing is looking at one copy and you're just copying it again. Copying exactly, word for word, letter for letter. Remember, this is God's holy word. This is the eternal word. So all they have to do is write it down exactly like it was in Hafsa's copy. That should be a no-brainer until you get and see what it says. In case you disagree, Uthman says to Zayd ibn Thabit, on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of the Quraysh. The dialect of the Quraysh. And here's where everything comes apart. Here's where everything comes screeching to a halt. And Shabir Ally didn't see this, and no one else seems to understand this. Because how then, this is not a recitation anymore. This is a written text. In case you have any disagreement, write it. That means written down, Arabic in a written text. In the what text? In the Qurayshi dialect. Hold on a minute. Do any of you see what I see? Have any of you picked this up? Obviously, Shabir Ally didn't see it, or if he didn't say it, because this is a real glaring problem, and nobody seems to understand this. How can you write something down, written down, in a dialectical text, unless you have vowels? Because dialects, by definition in Arabic, require vowels and require dots, require dialectic differences. You need to have vowels. You need to have the dama, the little curlicue that goes above the word. That's the u sound. You need to have the fatha, the little slash that goes above the letters. That's the a sound. You need to have the kasara, which is the little slash that goes under the letters. That's the e sound. So u, a, e. You need to have those three vowels. You have short and you have long ones of those three. But those are the only three vowels that you have in Arabic. Those did not exist in 7th century. Take a look at all these manuscripts. Let me just put a few up here. Just take a look and see. Here, just take a look at these manuscripts here. Here you can see the Sana'a manuscript. Here now we'll show you the Topkapi. Let's look at the Topkapi. Can you see any vowels on any of them? Is there any dama? Is there any kasra? Is there any fatha? I don't see any. And even all of them, do you see any dots in them? Do you see any dots here in any of these manuscripts? Take a look. There's no dots there. So this was in the 7th, this is now the early 8th century that I'm showing you these manuscripts. These aren't 7th century manuscripts. These are 8th century manuscripts. Arabic didn't have, you couldn't read it. And that's why I gave that other video. I put that video up there so you can see what I'm talking about. There was no reference point, or there was no possibility to have a Qureshi dialect written in a written text. Because not in the 7th century, but remember, when were these written? When were these documents, these 2 pages, Al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509, when were they written? 509 and 510. These were written in just before 870, between 850 and 870, the last 20 years of his life, when Bukhari finally died. That's the late 9th century. So here you have a real glaring error. Al-Bukhari did not realize, did not know, he didn't even know his own history. He certainly didn't know how Arabic, how it evolved. He didn't know that you cannot have dialectical differences in a written text, in a recitated text. Yes, but not in a written text. And this is a written text. And here's where Shabir Ally comes undone. Can you then understand why you need to look at what he's not saying? Whether or not Shabir Ally doesn't know this, or maybe he just doesn't want to talk about it, maybe he doesn't want to see it, but then you got to go on to what happens next. Then they took every one of these Qur'anic materials, so we're talking about manuscripts, okay, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies. So while we're talking about paper, we're talking about something that had to be written down, okay? It's very clear in Al-Bukhari, we're talking about a text, we're talking about parchment, or we're talking about vellum, or we're talking about papyrus. In this case, it's more like a parchment, because we're talking about Uthman. He was very wealthy, he could afford animal skin. Nonetheless, he ordered that all the other parchments and fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies be burnt. This is something Shabir did not want to talk about. So these differences really had nothing to do with recitation. You do not burn recitation. You don't burn what people are saying. What do you do? Burn their tongues? Burn them? When you burn something, you're burning actually a material object. You're burning a text. You're burning a paper. You're burning a parchment. You're burning a piece of vellum. You are burning manuscripts. It says so, right in black and white. So this burning means that these were completely different manuscripts. Do you get that? Are you picking that up? Why did Shabir Ally pick that up? No, he wants to talk about the ahruf and the qira'at. He wants to talk about the recitations. He wants to talk about the readings. What he doesn't realize is those recitations, those readings don't come for another 100 years. See, they don't come in until you look and you see. And I put the graph up before, and I'll put it up here again. This is what Hatun has put up, and this is why I use it all the time, because she's done a great job of looking at all the different recitations. These are the roughly 37, some say as many as 39 recitations. These are the qira'at. These are the authors of the different qira'at. And take a look at their dates. They're all in the 8th century or the 9th century. Can you see the problem here? So these qira'at in ahruf, when they finally got all these different dots, when they finally got all these different vowels, and they started writing their own text, they started coming out with many texts. Look at them all. These are 26 that we put up. These are the 26 that you saw in that video that we put up there at Speaker's Corner back in 2016. And you can see their names. These are Al-Duri. This is also Ibn Jabaz. This is Al-Susi. Alayt Ibn Khalid. You see Al-Bazi. And of course, you have Warsh and you have Hafs. In fact, when you look and see at these, as I said earlier, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of differences between these. Al-Bazi has 1,094 differences. Hisham has 1,300 differences. I came down to Abu al-Harith has 5,000 differences. For differences to what? What are all these differences? These tens of thousands, these hundreds and thousands of differences. What are they talking about? These are differences with this guy right here that I have circled in black. That's Hafs. That's the one that was finally chosen in 1924. He had became the standard. But look at when he died. He died in 796, the late 8th century. This is 144 years after Muhammad. So when Shabir Ally is talking about all these qira'at, all these different recitations, he's talking about something that happened 100 years later, not at the time of Uthman, not at the time of Muhammad, not at the time of Abu Bakr or Umar, not in the 7th century at all. These are 8th century. And this is what happens when you start adding dots, when you start putting vowels in, you don't know where the vowels go. You don't know where the dots go. And depending what dialect you come with, you put your dots different than the other dialect. You put your vowels different than the other dialect. And that's why there are dialectical differences in the 8th century, but not in the 7th century. Can you then see why? Oh, I'm sorry, this way. Not in the 7th century. In the 8th and 9th century, yes, but not in the 7th century. And this is why Shabir Ally, he's keeping our eyes over here. He wants us to keep our eyes on the 8th and 9th century. He wants to say this is a problem that happened, but he's redacting it back to the 7th century, as every Muslim do. They take what is going on in the 8th and 9th century. They take these exercises by all these different students in 5 different cities, in Basra, in Kufa, those are in Iraq, in Syria, and in Medina, and in Mecca. So these are places in Saudi Arabia today. These are places in Iraq. And these are cities, well-known cities in those different locales where students were putting together their different versions of where the dots go and where the vowels go in the 8th and 9th century, not in the 7th century. Shabir Ally would like to think this is happening at the time of Uthman. No, this is not happening at the time of Uthman, because there were no dots at that time. And these were actually written texts that were being burnt. And since they were being burnt, that means that they completely disagreed with that, which was the final copy that was then given by Zayd ibn Thabit to Uthman, according to al-Bukhari. Volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. Now, why didn't Shabir Ally mention this? Why didn't Shabir Ally mention about these burnings? Why didn't Shabir Ally mention that if you're burning something, it has to be material? These have to be in written text. Why didn't Shabir Ally talk about that? Because that's the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. He doesn't want to talk about it for very good reason. Because look what it says next. In the next thing it says is that Uthman then sent to every province one of these copies. Not a recitation, not a reading, but a copy of this finalized, canonized text that was then created by Zayd ibn Thabit, Zubair, Alas, and Hisham. Can you see that Shabir Ally doesn't want to talk about this next thing? Because if you're sending him out to every province, most scholars and most of your traditions can claim that there are only 4 of these that were sent out, 4 copies. One was sent to Basra, one was sent to Baghdad, one was sent to Damascus, and one was left in Medina. But if they're provinces, if you're looking at provinces, Hutton brought this up when we were on the ladder many years ago, and she says, hold on a minute, how many provinces were there? So she looked back to find out where the provinces were, and she found out that there were 9 different provinces at the time of Uthman. If this is 652 at that time, you had Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. Well, take a look. How many do you have? I count 9 fingers. 9 different provinces, 9 different cities. Every one of those 9 cities for the last 1400 years have been under Islamic control. And in the last century, Jerusalem has now been wrested from their control. But all of them for 1400 years, except for Jerusalem, are still under their control today. So where are those 9 copies? Now, I'm not going to demand the 9 copies. I would like to see where the 4 are, though. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, and Medina. Where are those 4? Can you show me even one of those copies that were sent to those 4 cities or those 9 cities in 652? Can you show me one? See, Muslims can't come up with even one of them. That's what Shabir Ally doesn't want us to talk about. That's why he was trying to get us deflecting, and trying to get us to talk about only the qira'at, the ahruf. And you're going to hear Muslims do this all the time. Every time you hear Muslims who want to defend their Quran, they're not going to talk about the minutiae that you read in al-Bukhari. But this is all they have to go on. they're going to try to keep it and spin it and spin it and spin it, that this is nothing more than different readings. This is nothing more than different ways of Al-Duri saying it this way, or writing it this way, or Warsh writing it this way, or Hafs finally writing it this way. And when you look at them, there's not really much difference. They don't change any belief. They don't change any practice. They don't change any doctrine. Well, actually, they do, but that's not really the big thing. That's really what he wants you to think about. That's really why they've had 1,000 years of these traditions, and that's why you will find these copies. That's why Hatun was able, and her team were able to find them. And now she didn't buy them all, but she found the people that bought them for her and brought them to London, and that's why she's up to 37 now. I have 26 there, and then in this one here, and these are 34. This is the last picture I took with her. These are 34. Oh, got it upside down. These are 34 that she has now. I've just been told she's up 3 more, so she's up to 37 of these different Qira'at, these different ahruf, which means you can buy them today in places like Yemen and Jordan and in Morocco. You can still get them today. They're still available. And the reason why they're available, because they don't really consider this a real problem. And for a lot of Muslims, they think that's all we want to talk about. That's all you want to, that's all they want you to hear. And that's why Shabir Ally was focusing on the Qira'at. What he's going to have to do is talk about the elephant in the room. And sometime he's going to have to talk about the textual problems, the textual history of the Quran. I remember when I was just a year ago, I was there in London up on the ladder. You can see the video. I'm not going to put it up here because it takes about 30 minutes, where Mansour Ahmed got on the ladder with me when we were introducing Dan Brubaker's newest book, the only book, the first book on these 20 corrections. And the corrections we were introducing at that time were nothing to do with Qira'at, were nothing to do with Aruf, although he thought they were. These were to do with the razm, the skeletal text, the consonantal text. These are the earliest of the manuscripts, and these are all consonantal differences. These are all kinds of erasers and coverings and assertions, deletions, all through these. I mean, he's up to 4,000 of these now. And I remember hearing Mansour Ahmed, he finally said, well, we don't really care, because we have a oral and textual tradition of the Quran that goes all the way back to Uthman. And boy, there were 20 cameras on him, and I quickly turned to him and says, you are claiming that you can find a textual tradition? You're actually accepting what Uthman said there, that it was written down, and that these other manuscripts were destroyed, that one that was written down by Zayd ibn Thabit, can you show me where that is? Can you show me one of those 4 copies? Can you show me even one copy? Can you provide one copy of those many copies that were sent to all the different prophets? Can you provide one? I'm not just looking for a scrap here. I'm not looking for a fragment here. I want to know one complete copy. 114 surahs. That is the same as this Quran that I have in my hand today. And he was quiet. You can see the video. We put it up there last year. He was quiet. He then wouldn't listen to the crowd. The crowd would say, give me an answer. What's an answer? He wouldn't answer. And finally he said, you didn't listen to me. What I was saying is the first century AH, that we can come up with 97% of the Quran by first century AH. So that's not, see, the first century AH goes up to 719. That's the 8th century. That's well into the 8th century. That's almost 20 years into the 8th century. I said, and I gave him 2 extra years. I said, okay, by 721, can you show me one complete manuscript, 114 surahs, that you can date by 721? I'm giving him 2 extra years. And he says, I can come up with 97%. What he wasn't telling the crowd, and what we now found out later, and what we now looked at, is when you go up on Islamic Awareness website, that 96% that they're claiming, not 97, that 96% that they're claiming is really 63 fragments, sometimes minuscule fragments that they found here, and they found here, and they found there, and they found there, and they put them all together, and they've got 96% by 719. We're talking about, goodness sakes, you're talking about 70 years after Muhammad's death. So this is a good 60 years after Uthman. They can only come up with these fragments. What they don't know is we've looked at those fragments. And those fragments are not from 719. I'm not going to tell you what I know now. We're going to do a whole series on this, so that's something yet to come. But we can pretty well know that there was no Quran at all. Not any manuscript that is 114 surahs from the first century of Islam. See, Mansour could not answer that on the day, and that's why he hasn't come back to us since then. Shabir Ally did his best to try to get us focused on the Qira'at, to keep us on the recitations, to keep us on the readings, to make sure we didn't talk about the consonantal text, the material that Dan Brubaker's coming up with. This is why Dan Brubaker's material is absolutely essential. In this next month, in June, he's coming out with his second book, looking at a whole nother slew of these manuscript variants. These are consonantal variants. Make sure you understand, when Muslims are talking about Qirat and Aruf, they're talking about the much later 9th, 8th and 9th century Ahruf in Qirat. They're talking about these readings, these differences in the way you read it. Dan's not talking about that. He's talking about the time of Uthman, the time of the late 7th century, the time of the early 8th century, when there are no dots, when there are no vowels. That's the most damaging material, because that means that these are completely different writings. These are completely different texts. These ones you have to burn if they disagree. Dan Brubaker has found over 4,000 of them. Can you then understand why this is getting more and more difficult for Shabir Ally? This is the man that used to claim that the Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Matil, those three were exactly the same as the Quran we have today. When I started debating him back in 1998 in the last century, he used to claim that all the time. He no longer claims that. And instead of actually accepting that there is no manuscript, none of these go back to Uthman, none of them are from the 7th century, none of them are complete, they don't even agree with each other, they don't agree completely with the Quran we have today. What he's trying to get us focused on is the readings, the recitation. And that's what my takeaway is from this video that he put up a week ago. He is scared to death because sooner or later he's going to have to start talking about the consonantal text. He's going to have to talk about those earliest manuscripts, which have no readings, which have no recitations. And he's going to have to explain to us, why are they different? And therefore, he is going to have to, at some point, answer the million-dollar question. So when was the Quran finalized? When do we get a complete Quran? Give us a date. Show us the manuscript. Show us the... This is the thing that we've been asking all the way through. Have you noticed? Muslims are always claiming everything they want about Muhammad, about Islam, about the Muslims, about Mecca. They're claiming all these things from the 9th and 10th traditions. And we're saying, no, stick to the 7th century. Have you noticed all these videos that I've been putting up? This is stick to the 7th century, stick to the time that Muhammad lived. Look at the century he lived and prove to us that there was an Islam. Prove to us that there was a Muhammad who is just like the traditions you're talking about in the 9th and 10th century. Prove that he lived in a place like Mecca, as the 9th and 10th century say he did. Prove that there were people called Muslims and there was a religion called Islam before 690, the late 7th century. Prove that there was a Quran. This is the same thing we've been talking about. I haven't changed my tune since January of this year. I'm still talking about the 7th century. Prove to me that there is a Quran, Shabir Ally, that is just like this book. Don't talk to me about the recitations. Don't talk to me about the Qirat and the Aruf from the 8th and 9th century. Talk about the 7th century. Where is this Quran in the 7th century? Boy, I've been asking this since 1998. 22 years ago I asked this. I'm still asking it. Can you then understand why he is being put into a box? Bless him. He has to say what he has to say. Bless him. He's trying his best to be as honest as he can. I'm so glad I'm not in his shoes. I'm so glad I'm not having to defend this book. I'm so glad I don't have to defend the claims that Muslims make about this book. Nonetheless, we don't have to make those kind of claims because we know our Bible is not an eternal book. It is not written on eternal tablets that sit in heaven. We know exactly where it came from. We know who wrote them. We give the names of the people who wrote them. Therefore, we've passed this test. We don't have this problem. We don't have to try to get people off on something else that we don't want to talk about. Thank God for the Bible, folks. I hope you're getting it. And let's see Shabir Ally come all the way home. He's got to realize this is not a book you can defend. This is not from God. This is not from eternal tablets. It's not even from Muhammad. It's not even from Uthman. Okay, so he puts 1924 as the date it was canonized. That's the time that the Ahruf in the Qirat was canonized, 1924, but not the consonantal text. When was the consonantal text canonized? There's the question I ask. That's the question I leave with you. And all you Muslims who are watching me, I want to hear an answer. Where was this Quran in the 7th century? Where is this Quran in the 7th century at the time of Uthman, 652? Show me. Remember, I've been asking, where's Muhammad? Where's Islam? Where are the Muslims? Where's Mecca? Where's the Quran? Okay, this is Jay. Over and out. God bless you. I've got to get to sleep. It's now 3:30 in the morning. You can hear the train going by. We'll see you in the morning.